Santa Anita cowboys rested under a tree at Rancho Santa Anita in 1890, the rancho system already being absorbed into the American land economy that would eventually convert their entire working landscape into a racetrack, a shopping center, and a suburb. A young Liberian soldier accused of looting and murder was bound to a telegraph pole before being shot by a firing squad on November 21, 1992. Patrick Robert photographed him in the moments before. The civil war that produced this execution killed 250,000 people. Welcome to the British Gallery channel. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on more videos like this one. BJ Day celebrations erupted across America on August 15, 1945. The war with Japan ended 4 years and 8 months after Pearl Harbor. The colorized photograph restores what black and white documentation had flattened: the specific colors of the uniforms, the flags, and the faces of people who had just survived something enormous. Vivien Leigh smoked up to 4 packs daily during the filming of Gone with the Wind in 1939. The role required her to perform emotional devastation for months under a director famous for demanding dozens of takes. The cigarette break was the only pause the production reliably allowed. Macmillan, Eisenhower, de Gaulle, and Adenauer stood together in Paris in 1959, 4 men who had each survived the Second World War in different roles and were now managing the peace it had produced. Between them, they governed the Western Alliance at the height of Cold War tension. Downtown Kabul in early 1979 had functioning shops, paved streets, and visible civic life, photographed weeks before the Soviet invasion that began in December. The city in this frame would not look like this again for decades. The invasion erased what the photograph documents. Gustav Stresemann's funeral in Berlin in 1929 drew hundreds of thousands of mourners because they understood correctly that the Weimar Republic's best political chance had died with him. Hitler became chancellor 4 years later. Stresemann was the obstacle that death removed before its time. Thousands of machetes were abandoned at the Rwanda-Tanzania border on January 1, 1994, Hutu refugees allowed to cross only if they left their weapons behind. The machetes had been used to kill approximately 800,000 Tutsi people in 100 days. The border crossing required leaving the evidence. German bombing turned Stalingrad to rubble on October 2, 1942, the beginning of the battle that would consume both armies for 5 months and kill approximately 2 million people. The smoke rising from the ruins in this photograph marks the start of the most destructive urban battle in recorded history. Conquering Bear of the Oglala Lakota Nation was photographed by Adolf Muhr and Frank Reinhardt in 1899, 23 years after Little Bighorn, at a moment when the Lakota's formal sovereignty had been legally eliminated, but the photograph preserved the presence of someone who had lived inside it. The lagoon at Betio, after the assault on Tarawa in November 1943, was described as hell on earth by the Marines who survived it. 76 hours of combat killed 1,000 Americans and 4,500 Japanese defenders on an island 2 miles long. The lagoon held the evidence. Passengers sat in the salon of the British airship R-100 in 1930 during its brief transatlantic service. The vessel scrapped after the R-1 crashed in France, killing 48 people later that year. The passengers in this photograph were among the last to travel by airship in commercial comfort. Walter Harper summited Denali first in 1913 at age 20, a feat the world barely noticed because he was Alaska native and his guide received more credit. He died 5 years later when the SS Princess Sophia sank in 1918, killing all 353 aboard on his honeymoon voyage. Wernher von Braun sat in his Huntsville office in 1965, the German rocket engineer who developed the V-2 that killed thousands of British civilians and was brought to America under Operation Paperclip to build the Saturn V that reached the moon. His office contained both histories simultaneously. DiMaggio, Borge, Bryant, Arley, Parks, and Trump received the Ellis Island Medal of Honor together on October 27, 1986. 6 people whose connection to the medal's theme of immigrant contribution varied considerably. The photograph documents a ceremony. The biographies of its recipients document something considerably more complicated. Papuan orderly named Raphael Imbari aided a wounded Australian soldier near Buna on Christmas Day, 1942, the photograph that gave the Kokoda campaign its most recognizable image. The Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels carried wounded soldiers through terrain that mechanized transport couldn't reach. Imbari received no official recognition for decades. Maharaja Digvijaysingji of Nawanagar sheltered over 1,000 Polish children and women in the Balachady camp from 1942 to 1946, refugees who had survived Soviet deportation and the journey through Iran. He provided education, food, and shelter without charge. The children called him Bapu, meaning father. Oviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter lay dismantled in Kabul in the early 2000s, the same aircraft type the Soviets had used during their 1979-1989 occupation. The wreck outlasted the empire that built it by over a decade. Sitting in the city the helicopter had once patrolled from above. Rachel Corrie was killed by an Israeli military bulldozer in Rafah on March 16, 2003, while standing in front of a Palestinian home scheduled for demolition. She was 23 years old. The Israeli military investigation found the driver couldn't have seen her. Her family has disputed this conclusion since. Franklin Roosevelt chatted with Georgia farmers near Warm Springs during the 1932 campaign. The candidate, who had been coming to Warm Springs since 1924 for polio treatment, understood rural Southern poverty at a proximity most politicians avoided and ran on promises to address it directly. Salvador Dali presented Franco with a painting of his granddaughter Carmen on November 8, 1972. The surrealist, who had been a socialist in his youth, photographed, presenting art to the dictator who won the civil war that had divided Spanish artists between collaboration and exile. Korean soldiers guarded Qing army prisoners in Pyongyang during the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, a conflict fought on Korean soil between China and Japan over Korean suzerainty. Korea had no voice in the war, determining its own political future. Japan won, and Korea became a protectorate within 11 years. Ronald Reagan aimed a rifle aboard Air Force One on November 23, 1983, 1 month after 241 Marines had been killed in a Beirut bombing, and 3 weeks after the U.S. invasion of Grenada. The president photographed with a weapon in the year when American military force was being used and questioned simultaneously. An artist painted the ruins of San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake that registered 8.25 on the Richter scale and killed approximately 3,000 people. The fires that followed destroyed more of the city than the shaking. The artist documented what required rebuilding while it was still smoking. Marilyn Monroe and Jack Lemmon spent weeks on the set of Some Like It Hot in 1959. Lemmon and Curtis in drag, Monroe repeatedly unable to deliver single lines, requiring dozens of takes. Wilder said directing her was the hardest and most rewarding thing he ever did. The film is considered perfect. Marilyn Monroe signed an autograph on a 13-year-old fan's item at the Beverly Hills Hotel in 1954. The same year she performed for troops in Korea and filmed The 7-Year Itch. She was the most photographed woman in the world that year. She signed anyway for one fan at a time. Marilyn Monroe performed for stationed troops in Korea in February 1954, 10 shows in 4 days for approximately 100,000 soldiers in temperatures below freezing. The Kodachrome slides preserved the specific colors of her dress against the military crowd. She said it was the greatest experience of her life. Rita Morneau appeared in So Young, So Bad in 1950 at age 18, her first on-screen role beginning a career spanning over 80 years. She became the first Latina to achieve EGOT status, winning every major American entertainment award. The first film gave no indication of the scale of what followed. Gina Lollobrigida attended the Cannes Film Festival dinner in May 1958, photographed in Agfachrome, which rendered her with a color palette slightly cooler than Kodachrome would have. She was one of the most photographed actresses in Europe that decade. The dinner was one of hundreds of similar evenings. Vivien Leigh smoked 4 packs daily during Gone with the Wind's production in 1939. The role's emotional demands and the director's relentless retakes compressing months of strain into a performance that won the Academy Award. The cigarette break was the production's only concession to the limits of what the camera could extract. An Italian woman was photographed at Ellis Island around 1906, one of approximately 1.3 million immigrants who passed through Ellis Island that year. The portrait is formal and unsmiling in the way that immigration documentation required composure rather than expression. She is unidentified. The photograph is all that remains of her arrival. A Provincetown fishing family gathered around a tabletop radio in 1942, the radio providing war news, weather, and whatever music reached the Cape. The fishermen's livelihood was connected to conditions the radio reported. The family listened together in the specific intimacy of people sharing one receiver. Bobby Darin commissioned a $150,000 hand-built automobile in 1959, the year he recorded Mac the Knife, and was the biggest name in American popular music. The car reflected the scale of what that year felt like from inside it. He was 23 years old and couldn't imagine what diminished looks like. 3 children sat at the doorway of their Vian, Oklahoma home in 1939, while their mother worked in the fields and tea. Their father had deserted the family. The Depression had removed every margin that might have prevented the situation the 3 children were photographed inside of. The Walsh family posed for their portrait in Ireland on May 21, 1919, 1 year into the Irish War of Independence. The glass negative preserved them in a specific moment of national crisis. The photograph's domestic composure gives no indication of the violence happening outside the frame. A couple strolled the shore in the 1920s with the ease of people who had found each other and were not currently required to explain it. The sea behind them is the same sea. The simplicity was real. The caption calling it simpler is the photographer's interpretation. Sophia Loren stood with her mother on the set of More Than a Miracle in 1967, 2 women who had survived poverty in wartime Naples together, photographed on a film set that represented how far the distance between origin and arrival could be stretched by one specific kind of talent. Luna 3 photographed the moon's far side on October 7, 1959, the first time humans had seen the hemisphere permanently turned away from Earth. The images were blurry by modern standards and showed a surface more heavily cratered than the near side. The mystery of what was there was resolved in one transmission. East Germany paraded its computers on July 4, 1987, the American Independence Day date presumably coincidental. The GDR's attempt to demonstrate technological competence through a military parade format revealed more about the system than the computers did. The country ceased to exist 2 years later. Dr. Eduard Bloch treated Clara Hitler for breast cancer and was protected by her son as the noble Jew, allowed to sell his home and emigrate to America in 1940, while other Austrian Jews were being imprisoned or killed. He lived in the Bronx until 1945. The protection was singular and unexplained. Grandfather and his race car at Riverside Speedway in Memphis in the 1960s, the specific pride of someone who built or drove something fast and wanted a record of it. The track, the car, and the decade exist in this photograph with the particular vividness of things that no longer exist anywhere else. Harold Wilson and the Beatles were photographed together in 1964, the Prime Minister and the 4 young men from Liverpool whose cultural significance that year exceeded that of most governments. Wilson understood the politics of being photographed with them. They understood the politics of being photographed with him. Young beachgoers clustered around a portable radio at Coney Island in July 1947, before transistor radios made portability cheap and common. The radio they gathered around was heavy and expensive and worth clustering around because the alternative was no music at all on the beach that afternoon. Stan Lee was photographed at the Marvel Comics offices in 1970, the year after the Fantastic Four had been running for 9 years and Spider-Man for 8. He was 47 years old and had already created most of the characters that would eventually generate billions of dollars in film revenue he would never fully share in. Milan's first telephone booths appeared in 1952, the infrastructure of public communication installed in a city rebuilding from the war, the booths representing the democratization of a technology that had previously required either a home phone or an operator. Milan used them until mobile phones made them furniture. Thurman Roten photographed New York skyscrapers in 1932. The Empire State Building had been completed the previous year, and the skyline was at its most dramatic configuration before subsequent decades added more towers to compete with it. Roten composed the steel and glass as though it were landscape. It was. Bruno Barbie documented May 1968 on Boulevard Saint-Germain, students throwing cobblestones at police in a city whose streets were literally being used as weapons against the state. He photographed both sides with equal attention. The cobblestones had been pried from the street by the people walking on it. Sergei Parajanov was photographed in Tbilisi in 1980 by Yuri Mechetov, the filmmaker who had survived Soviet imprisonment on manufactured charges and was continuing to work with the quiet intensity of someone who had outlasted a system specifically designed to silence what he was. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. stood in the White House greenhouse in 1902 with a hyacinth macaw. The president's children kept a zoo of animals, including a badger, a bear, a hyena, and multiple snakes. The greenhouse no longer stands. The macaw was one of the more photogenic residents. Shanghai Mayor Jiang Zemin debated 3,000 students at his own university for 5 hours during the December 1986 protests, an engagement he would not repeat after becoming General Secretary. The 5-hour debate was the last time he addressed dissent directly on its own terms. Crow tribal scouts worked for the USA. RMY in 1898, photographed in a role that positioned them against other indigenous nations, the Crow having made strategic alliances with the United States during the wars that reshaped the Great Plains. The Scouts served the army that had enclosed them. Allied soldiers stood in the bombed-out windows of Hitler's Berghof residence at Berchtesgaden in 1945, the mountain retreat the Nazi leader rarely visited, now occupied by men who had fought across Europe to reach it. The building was deliberately destroyed by SS troops during the retreat and bombed by the RAF. Zurich riot police faced serious student unrest in 1983. The Swiss city's youth movement, demanding an autonomous cultural center, had been producing confrontations since 1980. The Zurich youth movement was one of Europe's most sustained urban protest movements of the decade. The shields held. The protests continued regardless. Japanese troops booby-trapped a cabbage with a Type 97 grenade on Okinawa in April 1945. The island's defenders had constructed an elaborate system of tunnels, hidden positions, and concealed weapons that transformed the entire landscape into a potential threat. The vegetable was as dangerous as anything else on the island. A Russian Tatar man sold Imperial Japanese national uniforms in colonial Seoul in 1941. A photograph from the Keijo Nippo newspaper documenting the colonial economy's intersection of Japanese imperial fashion policy and stateless intermediary merchants in a city under Japanese occupation. The uniform, the seller, and the city all belonged to different worlds. The San Francisco earthquake struck at 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, 42 seconds of shaking, followed by fires that burned for 3 days and destroyed 80% of the city. Over 3,000 people died. The city rebuilt within a decade in what remains the fastest urban reconstruction in American history. Rudolf Höss was hanged at Auschwitz on April 16, 1947, the camp's longest-serving commandant, executed on the grounds of the camp he had administered, at the specific request of former prisoners who understood that the location carried meaning the gallows alone could not provide. He had murdered over 1 million people. Randy Sellers was arrested for public intoxication on August 16, 1980 at age 17, dropped off a mile from his home by police, and was never seen again. The case was never solved. He was 17 years old. The mile between the police car and his front door remains the entire mystery. Albert Einstein's desk was photographed the day after his death on April 18, 1955. Ralph Morse arriving with a camera and a case of whiskey to gain access and document the final state of the workspace where the century's most consequential physics had been worked out. The papers were still spread as he had left them. Susanna Hoffs of the Bangles was photographed with her dog by Jeffrey Newbury in 1991, 4 years after Eternal Flame, and 2 years after the band had gone on indefinite hiatus. The photograph documents the gap between the public version of Someone and the Tuesday afternoon version, which includes a dog. Houston police stood outside Andrea Yates' home in Clear Lake City in June 2001. She had drowned her 5 children in the bathtub that morning. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity in her second trial and committed to a state mental hospital, where she remains. San Franciscans watched their city burn following the April 18, 1906 earthquake. The fires that followed the shaking destroyed more than the shaking itself, burning for 3 days across 490 city blocks. The people in the street are watching the destruction of everything they recognized as their city. Ringo Starr and Frank Zappa were photographed during the filming of 200 Motels in 1971, Zappa's surrealist rock film that used the Mothers of Invention's touring life as raw material. Starr played Frank Zappa in the film. The casting logic was entirely consistent with both men's sense of humor. Congressman Leo Ryan was photographed bloodstained in Guyana on November 18, 1978, hours before he was shot dead at the Port Kaituma airstrip by Jonestown guards. That evening, Jim Jones ordered the murder-suicide of 918 people. 300 were children. Ryan was the only U.S. congressman killed in the line of duty. Rocky Marciano retired undefeated at 49-0 in 1956, the only heavyweight champion in history to finish his career without a loss or a draw. He posed with Eisenhower with the specific ease of 2 men who had each dominated their respective fields completely and recognized that quality in each other. Jack Nicholson co-wrote and co-produced Head with the Monkees in 1968, a film that deliberately dismantled the manufactured teen idol image the band had been built around. The studio understood neither the film nor the intention. It failed commercially and became a cult object of exactly the kind it was made for. Bobby Darin stood beside his $150,000 hand-built car in 1959, the year Mac T. He knife made him the biggest name in American popular music. The car was as extravagant as the year felt from inside it. He was 23 and building something he didn't know would peak this soon. Jimmy Lee Gray was executed in Mississippi in 1983 for the murder of 3-year-old Deressa Jean Scales. The execution was so botched, the executioner was reportedly drunk, that Gray spent 8 minutes dying while witnesses fled the chamber. Mississippi changed its execution method directly because of what happened that evening. A young girl and her horse share a smile in 2014, the horse displaying the flamen response, curling its upper lip to analyze a scent, producing an expression that looks precisely like laughter. Robert Rusenbeek photographed the coincidence of timing that made 2 unrelated expressions appear to be one shared joke. The Space Shuttle rode atop a modified 747 at Washington Dulles in 1986, while Concorde crossed behind them, 2 retired aircraft sharing one frame that cannot be recreated. Both programs have been discontinued. The photograph documents a specific afternoon when the 2 most ambitious aviation programs of their era occupied the same sky. Mahmoud Ajar was 9 years old when an Israeli attack on Gaza City in March 2024 severed both his arms. He was photographed afterward, a portrait that requires no caption to communicate what war does to the bodies of children who are in proximity to the targets being struck. A suffragist carried a timeless message through Washington on April 15, 1920. The 19th Amendment had been ratified 8 months earlier, granting women the vote. The message predated the amendment and would outlast the century. Washington in 1920 was still deciding whether the ratification meant what it said. A horse-drawn wagon navigated Canyon de Chelly around 1900. Frederick Monson, photographing a landscape the Navajo had inhabited for centuries and which was simultaneously being incorporated into American tourism and federal land management. The canyon walls held petroglyphs older than any wagon that had passed beneath them. Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro spent 2 weeks in St. Martin in 1979 writing Raging Bull, the film that most critics now consider among the greatest ever made. The 2-week holiday produced the screenplay. The screenplay produced the film. The film produced a performance De Niro has never quite matched since. Eric Smith was 13 when he murdered 4-year-old Derek Roby in Savona in 1993, luring him into the woods and beating him with rocks and a tree limb. He was tried as an adult, convicted, and released in 2022 after serving 29 years. The case raised juvenile sentencing questions that remain unresolved. A policeman caught boys sneaking a look at Bertram Mills' circus rehearsals in Luton on April 15, 1938. The specific English childhood crime of wanting to see something before you were supposed to, caught in the act by an officer who has been photographed in the act of catching them. Johnny Eck was born without the lower half of his body in 1911 and became one of America's most recognized sideshow performers, starring in the film Freaks alongside his twin brother Robert, who was born complete. The two brothers photographed together in the 1920s represent one origin and two entirely different lives. A Tennessee River mother in 1936 wore a skirt made from a flour sack while caring for 9 children in a makeshift riverside settlement. The flour sack fabric companies had begun printing in patterns specifically because Depression-era families were making clothing from them. The sack became the era's unofficial textile. Roger Fenton was the first war photographer, his mobile darkroom van carried to the Crimean War in 1855 to document a conflict the British public had no visual record of. He photographed landscapes and officers rather than bodies. The images he made were the first photographs of war that a mass audience ever saw. Anthony Crawford owned 427 acres of South Carolina farmland and was one of the state's wealthiest black farmers until a white mob murdered him in 1916, seized his land, and gave his family 2 days to flee. No charges were filed. The land transfer was considered legal by the same authorities who witnessed the murder. Mary Wallace was 22 when she became the first woman to drive a CTA bus in Chicago in 1974, the job requiring a 2-year wait after women were first permitted to apply. She drove her first route through downtown Chicago traffic without ceremony. The history was made on a schedule. Linda Murray won the Ms. Olympia title 6 consecutive times from 1990 to 1995, retired, and returned to win it twice more in 2002 and 2003, the most dominant competitive bodybuilder in the history of her division. She is photographed with the specific confidence of someone who has proven their case 8 times. A chubby baby smiled for a photograph in the 1940s with the complete commitment that babies bring to moments of genuine delight, the smile requiring nothing from her and giving everything to whoever was behind the camera. The photograph has survived longer than anyone in it. Donielle Luna wore a gold Halston dress to Sly Stone and Kathy Silver's wedding reception in New York on June 5, 1974, the first black model to appear on the cover of British Vogue, photographed at a reception that represented the specific intersection of music, fashion, and cultural transformation that 1974 New York contained. Yankee Stadium opened on April 18, 1923, the house that Ruth built, named for the player whose drawing power had made the new stadium financially possible. Ruth hit a 3-run home run in the first game played there. The stadium that opened that day was demolished in 2009. President William Howard Taft threw the first ceremonial baseball on April 14, 1910, beginning a tradition every subsequent president has continued except Jimmy Carter. Taft was a genuine baseball fan. The tradition he started has outlasted every other aspect of his presidency in public memory. Defecting German pilot delivered a Messerschmitt Me 262A1 to American forces on March 31, 1945, the world's first operational jet fighter, whose performance had alarmed Allied commanders since its combat debut. The pilot crossed the lines with the aircraft intact. The technology it contained accelerated post-war jet development immediately. The Archers by Benjamin Carr was performed at the John Street Theater in New York City on April 18, 1796, the first opera written by an American composer, performed in a country 20 years old, in a city still learning what it meant to have a culture distinct from Europe's. The San Francisco earthquake struck at 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, 42 seconds of shaking followed by 3 days of fire that destroyed 80% of the city and killed over 3,000 people. The date is precise. The scale of what followed it has never been fully contained in any single description. Mary Surratt was arrested on April 17, 1865, as a conspirator in Lincoln's assassination. She ran the boarding house where John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators had met to plan the killing. She was convicted by military tribunal and hanged on July 7, 1865, the first woman executed by the U.S. federal government. Franklin Roosevelt died at Warm Springs on April 12, 1945, 63 days into his fourth term, with the war in Europe 3 weeks from ending. Harry Truman had been vice president for 82 days and had not been informed about the Manhattan Project. Roosevelt died before he could tell him. Metro Pictures, Goldwyn Pictures, and the Louis B. Mayer Company merged on April 17, 1924 to form Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the studio whose lion roared before films that would define Hollywood's golden age. The merger assembled the infrastructure, the talent contracts, and the distribution network that made the golden age structurally possible. Apollo 13 returned safely on April 17, 1970, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise surviving a mid-mission oxygen tank explosion that aborted the lunar landing and converted the mission into a survival exercise. The phrase they actually used was "Houston, we've had a problem." The past tense was accurate. Aleister Crowley completed the Book of the Law in Cairo on April 10, 1904, dictating the text he claimed was transmitted by a supernatural entity named Aiwass over 3 consecutive days. The text became the foundational document of the Lemma. Crowley spent the rest of his life explaining what it meant and finding new audiences willing to believe him.